Hi to, it looks like Greg and Wes are here so far. Hi, Wes. I'll give it a couple, maybe a minute or so, just to see who else is able to join in. Um, there's Mary. I'll give it maybe 30 seconds to see who else is able to jump in, and then I'll get started because I don't want to delay this or waste anyone's time. Hopefully, everyone's enjoyed the second chapter so far. As I mentioned last time, I think the first and second chapters are a little bit difficult on the scale of if you take the book as a whole. I think it will get easier, but I think the first and second chapters, it's kind of getting used to his writing style. Plus, he's approaching topics that we're aware of, but he's kind of teaching them in a slightly different light, or kind of presenting them in a slightly different ways. But definitely the book will start to get easier, I think. You're used to his writing style, and the topics will become very familiar to you. He's going to start getting more specific now into some of the theology and the doctrines. So hopefully it'll be something that allows you to start to sink even more deeply in. All right, so I have a few more joining, and I'm sure there may be others that kind of jump in as we keep going, and that's fine. But I'm going to go ahead and get started just so that you can get back to enjoying your Sunday. So firstly, happy Gaudete Sunday. So that's Gaudete is this third Sunday in Advent where we rejoice and we are preparing more for the Nativity and the coming of Christ at Christmas and spending this time rejoicing. So happy Advent to everyone. So with the second chapter, he's talking about the purpose of the law. And so what I'm going to do during this video is to summarize this chapter. And as you'll notice a little bit as he's teaching, he jumps around a little bit. He'll talk about a topic and then move on to something else, then come back to a topic just to emphasize some points. So I'm going to follow along in the book using kind of the outline that he gives. That way, in case someone wants to follow along in the chapter as I'm talking, they can. So it may bounce around a little bit, particularly on the topic of freedom. He talks about it early on and then again later. So I'm going to follow kind of his outline as I kind of summarize this chapter. But as we get started, the first thing I also wanted to do is to just open in prayer, just so that we can, hopefully get our minds right and allow the Holy Spirit to kind of guide us during this time, just to kind of hopefully learn more about God and about the different things that He's wanting to teach us today. Let me see. I was going to do St. Thomas Aquinas has a prayer for study, and this was suggested by someone to use this, and I think it's a really beautiful prayer. I'm just pulling that up really quickly. So this is a prayer by from St. Thomas Aquinas. It's something that people recommend to do before we're studying. So let's begin with a prayer in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. Creator of all things, true source of light and wisdom, origin of all being, graciously let a ray of your light penetrate the darkness of my understanding. Take me from the double darkness in which I have been born, an obscurity of sin and ignorance. Give me a keen understanding, a retentive memory, and the ability to grasp things correctly and fundamentally. Grant me the talent of being exact in my explanations and the ability to express myself with thoroughness and charm. Point out the beginning, direct the progress, and help in the completion. I ask this through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. And then we'll just pray the Our Father together. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, and deliver us from evil. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. All right. So I'm going to just jump right into this chapter and start to summarize a lot of the points that he's making. So in this chapter, he's going to make a second point. So chapter 1, he was talking about the purpose of man, the purpose of our life, what it is that God created us for. And now he's going to talk about in this chapter the purpose of laws. because he wants to, Frank Sheed wants to talk about how God has revealed to us that this life that we're living, because we are human beings, we're subject to particular laws. And so he's going to spend time in this chapter talking about the purpose of these laws. The first thing in the chapter that he starts talking about is that how early in life, every human being learns very quickly that there are laws in this world. And so he says that he also, early on, a child will discover some of these laws and realize that unpleasant things can sometimes happen if we decide to break the law. So as an example, if you had a little boy who was trying to jump off a roof and he falls on the ground, breaks his leg, he's quickly discovered the law of gravity. If you have a child who is near a fireplace and decides to stick his hand in the fire, he'll get burned, and he'll quickly discover that the nature of fire is that it burns. A child may steal a piece of candy from a store, and then the child will quickly discover that the rules of respect for property, that stealing is wrong, and that we're called to do good and avoid evil, that there is right and wrong in the world. So these are things that people quickly discover. And so that's what he starts off by talking about in this chapter, is that we learn very quickly that there are laws. But he says that unfortunately, sometimes people simply discover the laws and accept that there are laws, but don't think more deeply about it. They don't ask the question of, well, why? You know, why are there laws that exist? Why is it that I need to obey these laws? And if I don't, there are consequences. He says some people just say, yep, there's a law, and they accept it and follow it, and that's it for them. And he says even people will begin to realize sometimes these laws exist that I don't necessarily like. Sometimes these laws are things that I disagree with, or I'd want it to, something within me wants it to be different. So for example, the boy who jumps off the side of the house, he would prefer to fly, but he quickly discovers that that's not reality. The reality is that there's gravity, and he's subject to that, even though he disapproves and he wants to fly. And so Frank Sheed talks about that whether or not we approve of certain laws, we discover they exist, whether or not we approve of them or not. And he says that we don't invent these laws, we discover them. And he says that in general, with majority of laws that exist in our world, man quickly discovers that if you ignore them or try to disobey them, that you'll realize you're going to be damaged, or something's negative or of consequence will happen to you. And he says you can pretend all you want that these laws don't exist, but if you do that, you're living in an illusion, because he says that in reality, we can't escape from laws living in this life. So then if you have questions, just post them on the side, because I'm definitely reading along y'all's comments as we go. So if you have questions, just type them in to the little chat box, and I'll answer them as we go. There's a little bit of a delay, I think, with me seeing the questions as you post them, but post questions, and as I see them, I'll take pauses briefly to answer them. So definitely post your questions. So then what Frank Sheed will talk about, or actually before I even continue with the chapter, I wanted to mention that discussion question that I put on the group page this week. This discussion question, it had a quote from Frank Sheed in his book, Theology and Sanity. And so I posted that, and hopefully you had a chance to read it. If not, if you didn't have a chance to read that quote, then go back and read it. But I'm going to summarize that quote here, and we'll talk more about it. Let me, before I do that, it looks like Mary has a question on the page of the bottom of page 25. Now, is this the chapter about the carpenter? Let me see, just to make sure I don't know which God could not contract a duty. Okay, so Mary's asking a question that it's the bottom of page 25 in her version, which I'm not sure what page it is in everyone else's, but it's about midway through the chapter, and it says that she's saying God could not contract a duty towards us by giving us more, but though God has no duties towards us, yet he has a duty toward himself, the duty of acting intelligently. Intelligent action means acting with a purpose. let's see, but let me just read it real quick. So I think what it's saying, just if I may have to go back and read this a little bit more to see this in the entire context, but what I remember this talking about it is that firstly, one important line is that intelligent action means acting with a purpose. So God, who is pure intelligence, perfect intelligence, he always has a purpose in how he acts. Similarly with us, if we're going to act properly, we'll always act with a purpose, not willy-nilly. But then it says that God doesn't have a duty towards us. He has a duty towards himself, the duty of acting intelligently. So I would say that what he's saying is that God he's not obligated to do things for us other than the sense that he has created us in a particular way with a particular purpose. And so what he does in his plan and providence is to help us achieve that purpose because of love. Let me see. And then he's kind of comparing this to the idea of the carpenter that we saw before, that there's a carpenter who uses a piece of wood and then makes a chair out of it. And then and he's saying that what's even a more miraculous situation is, unlike the carpenter, he didn't create the wood. So God made us out of nothing, not because of necessity, not because he needed us, not because of anything other than sheer love. So he loved us and wanted to share his own love with creatures, so he made us. And so it's not a matter of him saying he owes us something, or that there's some type of duty that he has towards us. We are just freely created by him out of love, and he created us to give him glory and to be united with him and communion with him forever. He made us out of love with the hopes that we'll respond with love. But it's not from what they're just glancing at what this line is saying, I don't think that it's a matter of duty necessarily, the way that God acts. But I'll read that section again and post something in the comments later if I want to add something more to that section. So hopefully that helped a little bit. And maybe I'll come back. If we have time at the end, I can maybe come back. I think the best way, though, if that doesn't help explain it a little bit, is I'll reread this in context again later and post something in the comments about that section. Okay. So for anyone just jumping in, I was just answering a question in the comment section about a particular passage in chapter 2. But okay, so I'll continue on talking, and then I'll pause intermittently to answer questions if you have them, so just post it. And like I said, I'll come back to that particular passage later when I have a chance to read it more. So okay, we're back to the discussion question for this week that Frank Sheed, the quote that I posted on the group page. And I want to just summarize that. I'm not going to read that quote, but I think it's a really good overview of what one of the key points of this chapter is. So what Frank Sheed talks about, I'm going to use my board again, my whiteboard, in this quote, but also in this chapter, is that what we discover is that in this life, there are two types of laws. Okay, so there are physical laws and moral laws, or you can say material laws and spiritual laws. So physical and moral are the types of laws that exist, and we can't escape from them. They're there. A physical law is something that it's how things must act because they exist within this universe. So like on Earth, for example, gravity exists. We can't escape that. It's a law of nature. If you drop a ball from the top of a building, it will fall if it's not acted upon by anything else. Another physical law, or a law of material things, is that fire burns. It's the nature of fire to burn. And so those are some physical laws that we can discover exist. Another thing is the moral laws. So the moral laws are how a person should act or ought to act. And so we discover that there's these two types of laws. that exist. And so what he says in this quote and throughout this chapter is we can't escape from this. We can't change it, no matter how much we may disagree or find a law, something that is that we disapprove of. We can't change it. So he says that, for example, a physical law, it's in the nature of fire to burn. He says sometimes that can be beneficial to us as human beings, because if we're cold, we can start a fire and it can warm us. But the fact that fire burns can also be something catastrophic. It can also be destructive. And just think about some of the devastating fires in California in the past few months. So it's the nature of fire to burn, and I can't change that. It's just sometimes it may be beneficial to us, sometimes it's catastrophic, but that's just what fire is. So like it or not, fire must act that way. It must burn. Fire has no choice but to burn. So then Frank Sheed says that sometimes people will get an idea that a moral law is different than a physical law, because they would say, well, fire doesn't have a choice. It has to burn. But as a human person, I do have a choice. Let's say just in the idea of stealing. That you should not steal is a moral law, but I have a choice. God gave me free will that I can choose to steal or not to steal. And so he says that people get this impression that there is a choice with moral laws that is different than physical laws. But what he goes on to explain is that people often get confused by this. He says that the reality is that a moral law exists because it tells us how we ought to live, and to live otherwise has consequences. And so he says, even though the fact that fire cannot choose to burn, with the moral law, the fact that it is possible for us to choose to steal, it is harmful for us to act against the moral law, act against the command to not steal. And he says that if we choose to act against the moral laws, we'll be damaged just as certainly as if we stick our hand in the fire, we'll be burned. And so he says it doesn't matter if a person acknowledges that stealing is wrong or even knows what God's laws are. If a person chooses to steal because the moral law is you should not steal, there will be negative consequences for that person. They will be damaged in some way. And the reason is because the moral laws are something that God gives us, telling us how we ought to live and what it is that we need to do to achieve the purpose that he created us for. So God knows what it is we need to do to fulfill our purpose. He knows what we are made for. And these moral laws help lead us down the right path to achieve that. And so even though the moral laws appear to have an element of choice, there are still very harmful consequences if you choose to act against them. So the last few lines of that quote that I put on our group page discussion from his book, Theology and Sanity, he says, I'm going to quote, "In other words, physical laws and moral laws are laws because we are what we are. If we were asbestos instead of flesh, fire would not burn us. If we were stags, adultery would not damage us either. Physical laws or moral laws, to know what they are is to know the reality of things, and to act in accordance with these laws is to act by the reality of things." And he says, and this is sanity. Because one of the points he makes is for people to ignore this reality, you're living in an illusion. You're not acting in a sane fashion. And so he's trying to emphasize that. So this is a good overview of what I think this entire chapter is about, is this idea that there are laws that exist. There's consequences if we act against them, whether it's the physical laws or the moral laws. So then going back to our chapter, he says that in regards to the laws, he then says that we cannot be free from them, but we can be free within them. So I want to go into what does he mean by this? We can be free. We cannot be free from the law, but we can be free within them. So what he's talking about is because we're human beings, the physical laws and the moral laws that we're subjected to are not because God is a tyrant or he's a dictator. It's because God made us in a particular way with a particular purpose, and these laws are him showing us how to achieve that achieve his purpose, particularly the moral laws. And so whether we approve of these laws or not, they're showing us how to achieve fulfillment. And he says that if we know these laws and act accordingly, then we will be most free to live life fully and to live in a way that will achieve our purpose. And so he says this is really what true freedom is. True freedom is becoming the person God made you to be. And the only way you can really be free to do that is by obeying these laws. So he's going to come back to freedom a little bit more throughout the chapter. And then the next part, what he talks about is that there are a few erroneous ideas when we talk about freedom and we talk about law. There are a few ideas that people come up with that are erroneous and that are false. And he says we need to be aware of that. One of these things is that some people will claim that because a law is old, that it's outdated and that modern man no longer has to obey it, or that it no longer applies to modern man because a law is so old. So a particular example would be marriage. And he mentions this, that God has revealed to us that the sacrament of marriage has some particular laws associated with it, if you want to look at it that way. God created marriage to be the union of one man and one woman for life. And so when two people are married, the bond of that sacramental bond is between the man and the woman and God, and that bond cannot be broken until the death of one of the spouses. And one of the things with marriage also is that God tells us it needs to be open to life and open to love and to be a bond of fidelity where the two spouses are faithful to each other. But he says that if you look in the world today, people say, well, this is the old idea of marriage. Modern man has now, discovered that marriage is different. That because the goal of life is happiness. And sometimes, when a man and a woman live together for so long, married, they can get bored of each other, or they can start to not get along. So in order to be happy, sometimes divorce and remarriage are okay. Or sometimes adultery is okay if someone gets bored, or there's this idea of open marriages. One of the spouses agree to have relationships with other people. So these ideas in modernity are kind of like to this idea, well, the marriage laws of Christianity are outdated. We don't need to listen to those anymore. But he says that the question of a law is not how old it is, it's whether it's a law or not. If it's a law, we need to uphold it. And so he says that it's just like the law of gravity. The law of gravity has been around since the beginning. When God, as old as the earth is, the law of gravity has existed. And so he says if modern man decides to reject the law of gravity because it's too old, then if modern man jumps off a building, ignoring the reality of gravity, then he'll soon find himself as a corpse, is what Frank Sheed says. And so it's this idea that people claim that these laws can become outdated. But he says if a law is a law, it's something we need to uphold for our sanity and to achieve our purpose. The next thing he says is that sometimes people can think that authority figures, like the government, could abrogate a law. And so he says that some people will claim, well, if a government says that it's legal, then all of a sudden it's become moral. So for example, he says if a government declares adultery as legal, then some people will claim that, well, now it's no longer immoral. Or or the idea with abortion, because abortion is legal, some people will claim that it's no longer immoral. And he says that, but any type of an authority like the government cannot negate a law. If a law exists, it exists because of who we are, and the government can't change this. And so he uses the example of acid. He says if a government all of a sudden decides that acid will not burn you, but then if you throw a bowl of acid onto someone's face, their skin will be severely damaged no matter what the government says. And he says it's the same thing with our soul, that our soul will still be damaged if we disobey moral laws, regardless of what any government says about them. And so then the third, another erroneous idea about freedom, which she hints at but doesn't get into in depth, I want to spend a little bit more time on because I think this is even more of an issue today. And we hinted to this last time a little bit about this idea of relativism. Is that sometimes I hear people today rejecting this idea of law and freedom because they said, I don't want anyone to tell me what to do. I don't want you to impose your views on me. And so a person may reject any type of authority outside of themselves as the source for any type of law. And so they see that if you tell me, well, this is the moral law, this is how you ought to live, that you're enslaving me, is what some people today say. And so they say, well, I'm going to live how I see fit. I want to do what I think is best for me. And no one can tell me what to do. So this is this relativistic culture that we hinted about last time. But this is a complete misunderstanding both of the purpose of law and of the purpose of man. And so true freedom is related to chapter 1 and chapter 2 of this book. True freedom is understanding who we are as human beings, what our purpose is of life, and how we fulfill that purpose, and realizing that laws are God's way of helping us achieve the purpose. And anything that impedes you from achieving your goal of the purpose of our life, anything that impedes us from that is really what's enslaving us. What's freeing us is what allows us to become the person God made us to be. And so the moral laws that God has revealed it's not because he's a dictator, but it's because he's our creator. He's our father. He made us, and he knows what he made us for, and he knows what we need to do in order to achieve that purpose. And so that's what these laws are, to help us achieve our God-given purpose. And so if we follow these laws, then we know we're headed down that right path towards our goal. If we disobey the moral laws, or if we ignore them, the laws aren't affected. The laws still exist. But if we ignore them, it's us who are harmed. It's us who are damaged. And so you're most free when you're following these laws. And so you can kind of go back to the analogy of fire. You know, fire burns. And if I convince myself that my flesh is fire resistant, it really doesn't matter what I tell myself. If I stick my hand in fire, the reality is I will be burned. I can deny the reality of a fire in my skin all day long. There's a couple other analogies that you can use to help understand this. And someone mentioned it in the comments last week, but there's a particular book. This is not something necessarily I recommend for the average person, but if you were ever to go for a theology degree or anything, there's a book called The Source of Christian Ethics by Survey Pinkers. And in this, he talks a lot about this idea of true freedom. Some people may want to, he talks about true freedom and what does true freedom mean and how can we understand that. And one of the analogies that he uses in this book is the idea of a piano player. And he says that if my child wants to learn how to play the piano, let's say we want them to be a piano player who's as good like Mozart or concert pianist. It's going to take time. It's going to take practice. We need to have our child with an instructor, with a teacher. The child needs to understand music, understand the rules of music, understand how to play a piano the right way. I mean, it's possible that a child could just ignore the instruction, ignore the rules, and go and pound on the piano, but he'll never make music. If that child wants to be free to play the piano and to make music, he needs instruction, he needs guides, he needs rules. And this is how a person can learn true freedom. And so rules aren't something that are kind of restricting us, they're freeing us to do what we are made to do. And so Pinkers uses that analogy. And he says that, in this life, virtue and the moral law and obedience to these laws are just like us learning how to play the piano to make music, to become the person God made us to be. That's what these laws are for, that to guide us. Another analogy that I like to use for this idea of freedom, go back to my board. So G.K. Chesterton has used this analogy, and then others have expanded on it since then. But imagine you have this giant cliff, and there's waves and water down here. And on top of this cliff, you have a playground. So you have swings and you have a slide. Okay, all kinds of playground equipment. You have a playground on top of this cliff. Then you put a fence So imagine that's a fence around the playground. Now, do we look at the fence that's sitting there around this playground and say, oh my goodness, that's so restrictive, it's imposing limitations on the children are no longer free to play? Well, no, we don't say that. We would actually be thankful for the fence because it's protecting the children from destruction, from falling off the cliff and dying. I mean, how many of you would take your children to this playground if it had no fence? You'd probably be pretty hesitant to do that. And so this fence is like laws in our life. There's another, so it was very interesting because not too long ago, some point in the past few years, there was actually a study done looking at this idea, though they didn't use a cliff. They just took a playground. I'm going to draw a line down here. They took two sets of children and they took them to a playground. So I put a playground. So there were two playgrounds. They were both just in the middle of a city. One playground had a fence around it. The other one did not have a fence around it. And they took some children to the playgrounds, and they each group of children had one or two adults with them. They were trusted adults who the kids knew. Then they watched to see what the children did. And what they saw was that the children who were on the playground without the fence stayed very close to the adult. They would use the playground equipment, but it was always whatever was in the close vicinity of that adult. Then the children who were, compared to the children on the playground with the fence, these children, the adult was in there with them, but they explored the entire playground. They played on equipment. They were free to roam. They did not feel threatened or concerned. They were roaming the entire playground using all the equipment. So we have playground without a fence. The children are hesitant. They stay very close to the adults, don't explore very much, versus a playground with the fence where the children are free to explore and they weren't hesitant. They could still see the teacher wherever they were in the playground, but were exploring the entire property. And so the fence, again, in both analogies is like the law. The law is there to guide us and to protect us. We're free to play and enjoy the playground like the children, but we have that fence to guide us, to protect us from harm. And so in this study, they discovered that these children could kind of sense that same thing too, that this law, or I'm sorry, this fence wasn't imposing a restriction. It actually freed them to have more fun and to enjoy the playground. And so so I think those are analogies for our life. So if you look at the cliff, for example, that playground on the cliff is like our life. And if we don't have the laws like that fence around us, we're at high risk for falling off and for damaging ourselves and even just causing destruction to ourselves. And then similarly with the children analogy, the law shouldn't be seen as some type of imposition. It's not, or an obstacle. It's something that frees us to enjoy life and to live it most fully with God's help and guidance to become who He made us to be. And so what we realize is these laws are to be able to help us be free to become who God made us to be. We can become confident in the choices that we make because we know the right path because God has shown it to us. So we can confidently make the right decisions. We don't make decisions on a whim. We see what it is that how it is that God's showing us to live, and that's the path we follow. Those are these laws so we can live rightly. And then God shows us this path of the laws, like the fence. Okay, so kind of getting back into the book where the next section that he is in the book. So he's talking about the moral laws and the physical laws. And so the next section he talks about is, well, how do we discover these laws? How do we learn these laws? How is it that we know that they exist? And so he first talks about the laws, the physical laws, the laws of nature. And he says that we can discover these things. So just because we live in this world and our day-to-day experiences, we can discover the laws that exist in nature. So for example, gravity. You drop a ball from the top of a building, it will fall unless it's acted upon. So that's gravity. If you throw a ball really hard against the wall, it's going to rebound at the same force that you threw it at and hit you in the head if you're not careful. And so, for example, Isaac Newton, not that this is important to to know all the different laws of nature, but I just picked this one out as an example. So Isaac Newton, he described the third law of motion. What this is, it states that every action in nature has an equal and opposite reaction. So like I said, if you throw the ball really hard against the wall, it will come back towards you with that same force. It's an equal and opposite reaction. If a teenager gets angry and punches a wall, if the wall doesn't break, then the same force he exerts on the wall will be exerted back into his hand, and his hand will break. And unfortunately, I see people breaking this law all the time in my day-to-day practice. People break their hands all the time from punching walls. And so this law of nature is there and it exists, and we discover it by our day-to-day things. But what Frank Sheets says is that often with these physical laws, we know they're there and we still break them. Just like with often it's teenage boys, but a teenage boy punches the wall and it breaks his hand. So he's now discovered this law of motion. Every action has equal and opposite reaction, but he doesn't care. He still breaks the law of nature because he's angry. Another law of nature of this world is the effects of alcohol. I mean, alcohol affects us and it decreases our reaction time and clouds our mind and our judgment. But even though we know this law, this kind of physical law of nature, the effects of alcohol, too often people will still ignore that and will drive intoxicated. And so these physical laws exist, and most of them we discover through our experiences, or the people have discovered them and taught them to us. And he says that the concerning thing is that these laws exist, we know they exist, and we still break them often. And so he says that if we're careless with physical laws, which we encounter every single day of our life, and we know that if we break them, it's harmful to us, and we're still breaking them anyway, he says that we can only imagine how dangerous it is in regards to the spiritual laws, the moral laws. And what he says is that these moral laws are so much more important than the physical laws that God has not left it to us to discover them. He has revealed them to us. He has shown us through his revelation what the moral laws are, because he wants to make sure we know them, because the consequences of breaking these laws are eternal. And so he wants to make sure we know these moral laws and can know how it is he wants us to live. Okay, so then he goes on to say that even though God has revealed these moral laws to us, we still have a problem. Because if we look around, we still see that things are not harmonious. I mean, even among Christians, we still break the moral laws. And so he says, well, what's happening? What's going on? Why is it that God has shown us the laws and we still are not always following them? And so he'll get to this more in some future chapters, but he talks here about our will and our intellect. And so what he talks about is since the fall, since Adam and Eve in the fall, there have been two consequences that, there's been many consequences, but two of the ones he's going to talk about in this chapter are what's happened to the intellect and the will. And so he says that because since the fall, we have our intellect and our will. The will has been weakened and our intellect has been darkened. And so what that means is that our will, we may know what is right and what is good, but we still may freely choose to act against that because our will is weak. It has a tendency to sin, it has a tendency to disobey. Our intellect is darkened, which means that it can make mistakes. It can lead us into error. Our intellect can convince our will to do things that it shouldn't do. And our intellect can think it's right, but it can be misguided. And so with these two issues, it sometimes causes some problems when it comes to the moral law. And so then what he says is that sometimes, oops, sorry, you can hear the dogs barking. Sometimes, oops, sorry about that, that's really loud, they're right here. So what he says is that sometimes God will make it very explicit how we're supposed to act in certain scenarios. Like he'll say, do this and don't do this. So for example, adultery. Jesus is very clear about adultery and what that means. But there are some times that God will not give us scenarios of what's right and what's wrong. He'll simply give us principles of what's right and what's wrong. And these principles are to guide our intellect and to guide us in making decisions. But sometimes our intellect can assess a situation wrongly, and then it can lead us to do something we shouldn't do because our intellect is misguided. And sometimes this can be because our intellect is sometimes we allow it to be influenced by all these other things that exist besides just God and His revelation. So he uses an example of a good Christian, a good Catholic who is kind of misguided. So to come up with an analogy, what I thought about was there's this college student that I know. And it's a college guy, and he's a good Catholic guy, but he loves God, he loves others, wants to do the right thing, he wants to obey God's laws, but he's been influenced by different things, society, his culture in the college, his friends, and so he's been convinced that love is something different than what the church actually defines. And so what he sees is that same-sex weddings, they're okay, and these gender identity issues, that we should just love people and accept what they're doing, and it's a good thing to let people live how they want, and it's a good thing to let people be happy. It's okay to support these lifestyles. But what Frank Sheed is saying is that he's being misled by his intellect, because he's striving to do what's good, he wants to obey God, but his intellect is misleading him to wrongly assess a situation, to misapply principles of the church and of what God has revealed. And so he says what's positive, Frank Sheed says what's positive or optimistic about this is that at the heart of things, he is wanting to do good, he's wanting to love, he's wanting to obey God. And so he says that what's hopeful is this person should be able to respond to catechesis and education because his mind and heart are set on the right foundation, but he's misguided. So he needs someone to lead him to understand what it is God has revealed, what it is that the church teaches, what it is that love actually means. And the hope is that because he is open and wanting to do what's right, that he'll change his mind and recognize the reality of what love means, and that he's misapplying the principle of love. So hopefully that makes sense. But that's what Frank Sheed is saying, is that sometimes people can be misguided and misled by their intellect. So we have to be very careful in following our intellect. We have to make sure that we really test things using Scripture, using God's revelation when it comes to us assessing situations. So what he's ultimately saying is that it's essential for right living that a person knows two things, and that's what he's talked about in chapter 1 and chapter 2. First, the purpose of our life, and then the second, the purpose of laws and what the laws are, and knowing that we can't escape these laws, and they're not there to be obstacles or impediments. They're there to help us to become free, to live, to become the person God made us to be. And then he says, but knowing the purpose of man's life and knowing the purpose of the law does not then guarantee we're going to still do the right thing, because we have a will that's weakened, we have an intellect that can sometimes make mistakes, and so we need to always be what the church would call like forming our conscience, always be studying and praying and reading and seeing what it is that God calls us to do and how God calls us to live, so that we can stay on this path that God has set before us, so we can follow his laws and live rightly. Now, toward the end of the chapter, he goes back to the topic of freedom. And Frank Sheed says that too often people hold that, this is kind of going back to what we've already said, but too often people hold that freedom means living however I choose and doing whatever I want. But he says, he can't emphasize enough that this is not true freedom. And then Frank Sheed gives the example of a person, a man, who decides to eat whatever he wants. He eats whatever he wants. There's no restraint. There's no limits. And he says this choice of eating whatever he wants is going to become a hindrance to him. It's going to become a hindrance to his life, and ultimately is going to lead to suffering. So I kind of you can imagine this person who eats whatever he wants. Maybe, he has cookies and cake all day long and eats nothing else. What's going to result is he's going to gain weight. He'll become more and more inactive. He'll start to get back pain. He may start to have breathing difficulties. He'll have other medical issues. And so he'll continue to kind of go down the slippery slope. And so what Frank Sheet is saying is that true physical freedom for our body relies on us choosing to do what is necessary to keep the body healthy. And the same thing applies to our soul. If we do not live how God asks us to, how it is that we should live, if we don't live that way, we can make our soul unhealthy. And then even worse, we risk the danger of suffering eternal consequences, eternal torments if we continue in that way. And so Frank is going to conclude the chapter by saying that, that if we know what we were made for, know the purpose of our life, and know the laws that we should obey, it's only then we can have true freedom. But this also means that we have to acknowledge that we depend on God. And we have to acknowledge that it's only through God's revelation that we can know fully our purpose and understand these laws that he's given us that show us the way to right living. But he says not everyone wants to accept God. And he says, and this is another problem with the world today of not knowing or denying the reality of God, because there's so much at stake. But we can use the analogy of fire again. Imagine if I pretend that this fire is not real. Let's say I have a fireplace and it's burning, and I say this fire is not real. I can pretend that fire is not real all day long. And no matter how much I try to deny it, the moment I stick my hand in that fire, I will get burned. And so the God-given purpose of our life is reality. And these laws that he's given us are reality also. And so if we deny either one of these things and we disobey the laws, or we live not in accord with how God asks us, then it's inevitable that the consequence of this is that person is going to be eternally harmed. And so he says that yes, we're dependent on God, but we also have to realize that God is a loving Father. And at the end, on that last chapter, he talks about how God is not a mad mechanic. He's not making crazy machines. He's not a dictator or a tyrant who has made us his slaves. And then he says, it was not necessary for God to even create us. God freely chose to create us, not out of necessity, but out of love. And he wants us to share in this love. He wanted to share his love with creatures and was hoping that the creatures would return his love with love of their own. And so God created like the angels and the humans, and he gave us an intellect so that we can know God, but also he gave us this free will so that we could freely choose to love him. And this free will doesn't mean that to disobey God, we're going to be immune from consequences. It just simply is an act of God's love. And so in a lot of the classes I give, I use this analogy, so you might have heard it before, but if a man truly loves a woman, then he asks her to marry him and spend the rest of her life with him. He doesn't force her to. Love continues to love and offers the love, even knowing that it might be rejected. That's love. And that's what God does to us. He loves us so much, knowing that it's possible for us to reject him. And that's why he gave us free will, is because that's an act of his pure love, giving us free will so that we can choose to love him or reject him. He does not coerce us. He does not force us. If God coerced us to do what he wanted, then we would be nothing more than programmed robots, right? So he doesn't do that. He wants us to freely choose to love him. And so he gives us a purpose, gives us free will so we can choose to either live and become the person he made us to be, or we can reject that plan, reject his purpose for our life. And then the result of that is we're going to become enslaved to our own desires, our own passions. We're going to fall off that path that leads us to our purpose. And that path that leads us to happiness, we're going to fall away from that, and we'll never be able to truly be happy. And so that's kind of how he ends this, is just understanding that God is a loving Father, and that we need to realize we're dependent on him, but we're dependent on a Father who loves us and wants what's best for us. And so we need to put our confidence and trust and love in him, and realize that these laws are given to us simply to help us achieve our purpose, to become the person he made us to be. So then he ends with that. And then in kind of preparation for chapter 3, the question is, okay, so he's talked about this purpose and these laws that help us achieve our purpose. So what is the purpose? And we know the answer. We know the answer is heaven, but he's going to go into that in even more depth in the next chapter. And so our purpose is to be with God for all eternity in heaven. Where no eye can see, no ear can hear, no mind can conceive what God has prepared for those who love him. And so that's what we're going to discuss in the next chapter. All right, so I will conclude with that. And then I'm going to look over here at the comments, just see what type of, questions that there are. Okay, so I'm going to the comment section. So Ray Lynn says that she wonders about the study of the children in the fence and the unfenced playground. A variety of personality traits and upbringing contribute to how children would behave. Has this been replicated? I didn't look into the study in too much depth. I just saw something about it and just thought it was a very interesting analogy to use for the talks. I haven't really explored exactly why the children behaved as they did, but it was just kind of just at first glance, just an interesting reality of what this showed, is that there is something that the fence adds. There definitely probably is more there are probably more confounding factors as to why the children did what they did. But it just kind of at first glance was just interesting to think about it in respect to this talk that we're doing. So I don't really know all the details of that study other than it was interesting. So there's another comment, I'll just read it from Greg. The nature of play, such as sports like soccer or baseball or tag, makes a fenced, safe area reasonable for even adults who are very aware of their own safety needs. Also, safety is not only what is visible and apparent. I remember when I was a kid playing baseball and I was in the outfield and an arrow shot through the fence advertisement. Right, yeah, so even adults, I mean, we can get a sense that having a fence is not there to be restrictive in a negative way. It's something positive. So I'm sorry about the dogs today. So the fence around a baseball field is to help you be able to play the game rightly. It gives you your boundaries. And that's not a negative thing to the baseball game. It's actually a positive thing because it sets up boundaries. So even as adults, we can recognize the benefit of fences in certain situations depending on what we're trying to do. And so that's the point, is these fences are like the laws, that they're boundaries for us, but not to impede us or impose us or be obstacles, or to help us fulfill our purpose. And one of the other things that I didn't use this analogy today, but I'll go ahead and use it since we have a minute. I often use this in a lot of my talks. This other analogy is this idea of our purpose and the laws. So imagine that you build a train. Okay, so you have this train, and you're kind of the developer, the creator of the train. Now, if you have this train, you have two options. You could put the train on train tracks, or you could put the train on a highway. Now, some people may say, well, just looking at this as kind of as an outsider, if you put up the train on the highway, he has all the open roads available. He can go in any direction, north, south, east, west. I mean, the highway can take you anywhere. There's no boundaries, no obstacles. Whereas on the train tracks, they're restrictive. That train can only go in one of two directions. And so some people might say, well, the train tracks are restrictive. If you put the train on the highway, that's a lot more of an indication of freedom, right? And that's kind of what our world would say today too, is I don't need laws. I'm going to create my own laws because I want to be more free to live how I want. So the relativistic culture is almost analogous to putting the train on the highway, that there's no boundaries, no limits. But the problem is the train is a train. So if you put it on a highway, it will go nowhere. The only way that the train can achieve its purpose and to do what a train was made to do was if you put it on the tracks. So the tracks aren't there to be restrictive or to be an obstacle. They're there to allow the train to fulfill its purpose. And if the train has a goal of getting, to the city on top of the hill or something like that, then the only way the train can get there is to follow the tracks. And so the tracks are freeing. It's freedom because it allows the train to achieve its purpose, fulfill its purpose. And so that's another analogy for us and for these laws, is that they may look restrictive on the outside, but what they're really there for is to be freeing, to allow us to be free to become the person God made us to be. All right. Other comments, questions? Anything else? Hopefully people are still there. I know last time there were a lot more comments that I saw on the page than even popped up to me live. So let me see if I can't jump in there on the comment section. For us, for these laws, is that they may look restrictive. No, you're hearing me play me. All right, so any more, it looks like that's the only comments and questions so far too. Any more questions, comments before we wrap it up? Definitely, as I said, next chapter, chapter 3 is on heaven. It's a, as I said early on, the next chapters are gonna have topics that are a lot more familiar to you. And so hopefully now that you're getting used to his writing style and as the topics become more familiar, you'll be able to, you'll hopefully be able to spend less time rereading paragraphs, and it'll hopefully flow a little bit easier. And like I said, I will go back to Mary's question later on after this broadcast is over and read that little paragraph that she had found confusing that I tried to address earlier in the video, but I'm not sure if I did it justice. So I will go back and read that section, and then I will just post a reply to that here in the comment section of this video later on, so you can look for that if you have further questions about that. All right. So thanks everyone again for jumping in and joining on. And if anyone has any other questions as they're watching this later, post them in the comment section. And as you do, I'll go back through the questions and comments, and I'll post replies to that in this comment section. So feel free to keep posting in the comment section as you go on. And hopefully you're enjoying the book. Hopefully you'll continue to enjoy the book. I think it only gets better. There's some upcoming chapters that I think you're going to really, really enjoy. So I think it only gets better. And thanks to Lisa and Aaron for their comments about the analogies. Yeah, I do think analogies are really helpful. I think Frank she gives some really good ones, but I know the ones I use tonight are ones that I often use that I think have been helpful to people. So I'm glad that you found those helpful. All right, well, thanks again, and I will post in the next few days, I'll post a discussion question for this week. If you saw on the group page, I did post the reading schedule for this week. We'll do chapter 3, and since we have Christmas coming up, I'll probably do this live video next Saturday evening, most likely. I don't necessarily expect people to be available per se to watch it, but if you're available, great. If you're not available, it'll be live and you can watch it anytime you get a chance during the holidays. It'll probably, I'm not sure the timing of it exactly, but it'll probably be either late afternoon or later on in the evening. So probably 3 or 4 on Saturday, or more likely it'll probably be 7 or 8 or something like that. But I'll let you know in the next couple of days once I look at my schedule. But read chapter 3, I put some supplemental readings, some from the catechism, and I also posted a link to an article that I wrote a few months ago about heaven. And so you may find that helpful as just supplemental reading for this week. All right, well, I guess before I go, there's one more comment from Albert. So Albert is talking about how he hadn't realized the conflict against the moral law and that it wounds my soul. He always thought of sin as a way of being in a state of grace. So I guess I'll take a minute to reply to that. So sin, what we mean by sin is an offense against God, and generally what that is going to be is a sin is going to be acting against the moral law, acting against God's plan and purpose for our life, and ultimately against charity. We act against charity. We act against love of God or love of neighbor for the sake of God. And so whenever we disobey those moral laws, that's what we understand as sin. And that sin, acting against the moral law, does wound our soul, definitely, in various ways. And I think in a few more chapters, we're going to talk more about sin specifically. So we'll come back to that in more depth. I don't want to spend too much time on it yet. We'll come there. But yeah, definitely sin is an offense against God, offense against charity. And so it does wound our soul. It damages us. And we'll spend more time talking about that. And the idea of grace, that you mentioned. That'll also come up in a few chapters. I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves, just because I want to kind of go in the same pattern that Frank Sheet is approaching these topics. That we will definitely talk about grace in a few chapters, and that will hopefully continue to help as far as broadening your understanding of things. All right, well, I will conclude with that, and I may see some of you here for the live broadcast next week. And enjoy this third week of Advent. All right, God bless.